All right. Hi, everybody. I'm Jen Lampton. Most of you know who I am already, but I am one of the people very involved with Backdrop CMS. I was around in the very beginning as a co-founder, and today I serve on the project management committee, which is our democratic leadership group where we vote on stuff and make decisions for the project. Today, I'm going to talk about configuration management for Backdrop CMS, which if any of you have experience with configuration management for Drupal 8, 9, or 10, it's a little bit similar. I'll talk a little bit about the differences as we're going through it, but just to start off, general overview of configuration management. In Backdrop and modern versions of Drupal, your site's settings are kept separate from your site's content. And this means that you can run a site in production and deploy new features without needing to take that site offline for any period of time or prevent new content from being created. You can just sync your configuration on the production environment without needing to worry about changes to your database, because configuration in Backdrop is all managed in files. In Drupal, the difference there is that your configuration is also stored in the database. You can still do a synchronize, but you're basically syncing from files you deploy to the database. So you are still managing, as a developer, you're managing configuration in files, but the production site doesn't use them in files. So that's the biggest difference, I think, between configuration management in Backdrop and in Drupal. So I'm going to talk about today mostly best practices for setting up configuration management in 3 different scenarios, and I'll talk about all of those. With configuration management, it's a little bit depends on the taste of the developers you're working with in terms of how you choose to have it set up. I'll talk about use cases for each of the 3 ways that there's actually 4 ways that I manage my configuration. And it varies by site and by development team. So first off, I wanted to start by showing you the user interface for configuration management and talk about how you can deploy changes using the user interface. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Here's one, share all. Okay, and then can you guys see a browser? Someone give me a thumbs up.
Yes.
Great, thank you. All right, so what we're looking at right now is the configuration management interface in Backdrop, and this lives under, oh, my full screen is being a problem here, hold on. The configuration management, there's a section called development, and your configuration manager is in the development part of your menu. So this is a task that's usually reserved for people who have a higher level of access on your website. And in here, what it'll do is it'll indicate if any of the configuration that's running on your site that you're logged into on this page is different than any of the configuration that is in code. So either being deployed or previously committed. You have 2 different directories that you're running off of. One of them is your active configuration that your site is actively running off of, and the other one is staged, which means that it's ready to import. In this case, I have a site that has some differences, and I thought I would use this as an example to show you what those look like. So here we have 3 differences in permissions. This is because I just uninstalled a module, and so this should show removal of those permissions, but let's take a look. So let's see, so for authenticated, this actually just looks like a removal of a description. So this is not important. We did recently add descriptions to roles, so these might all have these, but let's see if there's permission difference in here. No. Okay, well, I'll make another one to show you. But in the newest versions of Backdrop Core, we did add a description to user roles. And so that's what you're seeing is the difference here. What's committed, what had previously been stored in configuration did not include the role. I did do an update to core, and so that update was applied to the active directory. So what you're seeing here is actually something you wouldn't want to deploy because it's removing a new feature that was recently added. So this is great. I can talk about this scenario. This happens sometimes if you didn't commit your configuration changes. If you did this update in another environment, you might end up in this scenario. So I can walk through this in a minute. Let's just check another site. Oh wait, this is the same site. Another site. This one doesn't have any changes. Okay. So let's just go through this first. This is the user interface. I'll walk through an example of what it would look like to do a deploy. So this, just for some context, I'm currently in my Firefox browser right now. All of the sites that we're looking at here are currently running on my local computer. I have a Google Chrome window, and here we have the same sites, but these are the production sites that are running. So in a perfect world, my production sites won't show any configuration changes staged because they're up to date. So what we could do is deploy some configuration. So I'll just show you what that looks like. So if I wanted to change something about my website, and I'll change something that I don't think is being used anywhere. Okay, or something not terribly important. What I'm going to change here is my slogan, which in this case is Oakland, California. I could change that to Oakland, California, USA. I can just go ahead and hit save on this page, and it'll save configuration. It'll let me know that those configuration options have been changed. If I go to my configuration manager, it'll now show me this new system core file. And if I look at differences here, it'll say, hey, your previous version of the file, so this is the one that's currently running in the Active Directory, had USA. The one that's currently in your staging directory is just Oakland, California. So if I was going to import my configuration changes, it would show, it would reset that change that I just made to this file. This other change here just is it just changed false to 0. I think that's because we recently went through and made a bunch of changes to Backdrop to make it happier on newer versions of PHP. So we now have more true typing in here. So the 0 is the old version, and it should be saying false. Okay, so we can see the differences in that file. In this case, I do not want to sync here because it would reset the change I just made. So instead, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to the export interface, and I'm going to export the system core file. Export. Here we have, I think it's under configuration, system core settings. I don't know what these errors are. Worry about that later. So here we have the entire contents of the configuration file with all of my core values. So if I look here, I should have my new site slogan, Oakland, California, USA. So what I can do is I can take this entire JSON element here. I can go to my production site, so make sure it's the same site. I can go to single import export. I can do the import instead. I can hit import, and what it'll do is it'll take all of that configuration and apply it actively to my site. So if I go to the configuration development, no, what was it? System settings, site information, you'll see the USA change there. So that's an example of deploying configuration using the user interface. So in both scenarios, I exported from my development site and import to my production site. I don't usually do that most of the time for the sites that I manage. I usually manage all of my configuration in Git, but I just want to demonstrate that that's there if you need it. So if I were to go to the configuration manager here, it's funny, it should show the differences. We'll look into that in a minute. I don't know what's going on here.
And for the record, I'd like to say that Jen is doing on her live site.
Yeah, woohoo, do it live. Because if I break things, it's fine. I'll fix them later. I've got a lot of experience in breaking things. Okay, so I also want to demonstrate that you can export all of the configuration for your whole site. And this is something I occasionally use. I have some sites that I'm running on Pantheon that have been there since the very beginning of Backdrop. I did not set up configuration management and version control on those sites. So every time before I do a significant amount of work on the site, I will log into the production site. I will go to this page. I will download, maybe I should do that here. Just as an example, I'll go to the full export page. I'll export all of my configuration files. This is my site. Configuration. It'll give you a tar.gzip file. You just save that wherever you want it. I'm going to put it here, I guess. And then what I can do is import that into my local site. So if I go to, got a lot of stuff going on here. Not that site, this site. I should now have, whoa. Here, let me clean this up a little bit. So this is my configuration directory. Configuration directory on my local environment. You can see in here I have two subdirectories. One is called dev active, and that is where the configuration is running for my development site, like actively running out of that directory. And I have one called live active, and that is where my configuration is actively running out of on my live site. And this is the simplest configuration that I use for configuration management. I'll talk to you about how the synchronizing works via Git in a minute. But I just downloaded the tar.czip. I think I put that into the dev active directory. Config, yes. Okay, so I've expanded that. I'm just gonna remove it. And if I now do a git status here, it doesn't seem to notice any changes. Oh, that's because I deployed them from here to start with. Okay, well, let's go to Firefox. Okay. And now if I go to synchronize, oh, this is, I see, hold on, I'm on different websites. Okay, there we go. Yes.
Since it's a small group of us, I'm going to take liberty to interrupt you at the point where I'm losing your instructions a little bit. So you exported zip file, and in which folder did you put it?
I put it into the local actively running directory. So in my case, it was called dev active, but it is the active directory. Or
is there a default active directory or not really?
So if you're just going to install Backdrop out of the box,
Yes.
it will put all of your configuration files into the files directory. And it'll use like a config underscore and a random hash so that that directory is hard to find. And inside that, it'll put two. It'll call one called active and one called staging.
Because I don't see it. We have a site on Pantheon, right? And it does not have that directory.
So basically, you're just exporting so that when you go back to import, it just finds it, right? Doesn't really matter so much where you put it, right? It's just that when you export, you want to know the path, because then when you import, you have to know where to put that specific one that you just exported.
Yes, if you're going to import using the user interface, it doesn't matter where you put it because you're just going to be using the interface to export and using the interface to import. So if I wanted to do that, I've already removed the file, but I would browse here. I would find the file I just downloaded and I would synchronize. And what that would do is it would expand this file, drop all of those files into your staging directory. And then when you hit synchronize, it'll copy from the staging directory to the production directory. What I was trying to do is to bypass the user interface part and do that, expand all of the files into my staging directory manually. And this is part of my workflow doesn't usually use the user interface. So I'm a little bit more comfortable with just moving files around than I am using the interface to do it. But I would say if you don't know where files go, or you're likely to put them in the wrong place because you're clumsy like me, you're definitely welcome to use the user interface, and it will always put them in the correct place and then synchronize them from the correct place for you. So you don't need to know where your configuration files are if you're running Backdrop and it's complicated. You could just let Backdrop manage it, and it'll put them all in the files directory in the directories in which it knows how to manage them. You can manage them all through the user interface, and it'll handle that for you. But the next step of what I'm going to show you is how I usually manage them in version control. And so that in that case, you do need to understand where the directories are going to live on your computer and which one is currently active and which one is currently staging. When you do a default install, there's one named active and one named staging. And so it's very easy to tell which one's which.
So Jen, hold on, let me stop you here.
Yep.
So we are trying, so if we installed it on Pantheon, right?
Yes.
It is not in core, right? So at the top level, we have core, and then we have files.
No, files are
And-
not part of core. They're outside of your
Right,
file structure.
outside. So where do we store? And then we have the sites at the top level as well, which is great. So where do we store this configuration when we're working on Pantheon? Because
So why
files-
don't we wait? So Pantheon is my most complicated example, and I'm going to talk about that last.
Okay, that's fine.
So yeah, let me do these more simple examples first. So yeah, Pantheon is particularly complicated because they don't allow us to write active configuration anywhere other than the files directory. And so when you do Pantheon, you end up having it split where your active configuration is in files and your staging or version managed configuration is outside of files. And so that can be a little hard to understand that separation. But for this particular site, this is my simplest site, my personal blog site, all of my configuration is outside of my web root, so no one can navigate to it through the URL. And both of my directories, my active and my staging, are versioned. And it's a little bit confusing because active and staging are describing the directories, but they're also the name of those directories in core. Like when you do a fresh install, there's one called active and one called staging. You can name those directories whatever you want. Maybe I should jump to that right away. So let's see, this is my configuration file for my local site of my personal blog. And you can define the location of your directories. You can name those files whatever you want, and you just put them into your settings file, and Backdrop will run off of where these are. When you do a fresh install, it will write these for you. So it will say, this goes in files, and it'll put the name of the config directory, and it'll say active staging for the two locations. You don't have to leave it that way. You can move them wherever you want. And as long as where you move them matches what's in the settings.php file, you're fine.
So if out of the box, and do you have this on a out of the box installer? Do you have it there or no?
No, none of the sites I'm going to show you today will have an out of the box install copy of settings.php. These are all my local configurations.
So this will so if somebody wants to add config directory to
Yes.
the Pantheon site, do they need to simply add it themselves, right?
Yeah, wait till I get to the Pantheon configuration, because on Pantheon you need to do some additional configuration for that directory.
Okay.
So in this case, maybe it would be beneficial to show you what my directory structure looks like. So let's see, Jen Lambton, Backdrop. I have a doc root that contains core modules, all of the stuff you would normally have that runs your code. It has your files directory. So this Pantheon would have it right here too, next to your core directory, right? But I put my configuration directory outside of my web root. So it is next to my doc root. It's one level up. You can do this on Pantheon. You need to use your pantheon.yaml file. You need to enable what's called the web directory. And where I have a directory here called doc root on Pantheon, it'll be called web.
Yeah, so that's like Drupal. That's basically like Drupal then.
Yeah, it's the same exact environment on Pantheon. It doesn't know whether you're running Backdrop or Drupal.
So the beauty of this, one of the important things, Andrea, this is one of the, and probably everyone else here on the team, Jen, I'm a little bit coming from the learner perspective. That one of the great things here is this works exactly the same in Drupal and Backdrop. And by mastering it, you can use it both of any of the sites that you need for Drupal or any of the sites that you need for Backdrop.
Yes and no. With Drupal, the only thing you're managing is the staging directory. So you'll never have to worry about where the live directory is writing files. On Pantheon, the live directory is what remains in the files directory. That's the hard part. You don't have to worry about that with Drupal because it's in the configurations in the database. That's significantly slower. And so for Backdrop, we decided to leave it faster and running off of the files themselves. Although there is a movement to put it back in the database that it would be very easy to write a module that would add that back in. So if you want that way, you can have it that way. Okay, so for my very simple use case here, the one thing that's confusing is that my staging directory is named live active. And the reason it's named live active is because both of these directories are managed in version control, both the one that's running my dev site, which is called dev active, and the one which is running my live site, which is called live active. And by organizing this way, so I can show you what this settings file looks like on live. It looks identical, except for where it says active, it says live active, and where it says staging, it says dev active. What that does is it does this sort of like a figure 8 pattern, where on my local site, I can make changes and I can commit them in dev active. I can deploy and they automatically go into the staging directory, which is dev active on the production environment. And I can sync them, and then they'll go from staging directory to the active directory, which is live active. If I do something like a database update or make some change directly on production, I can commit those files to live active. I can do a git push. I come down to my local environment, I do a git pull, and those are automatically in the staging environment for my local environment. So I have the dev active directory running as my active directory on my local site, and my staging directory on my production site. On my production site, I have the live active directory running as the active directory and the staging directory on my local site. So they're both called active because they're both active, but they're also both staging. So you can name them whatever you want. This is just a configuration that worked for me. I prefer to call them active so that I know that those are important. Those are running files off of any individual environment. So the reason I call this the simplest configuration is because you manage both directories in both places, and you just hook them up to be in opposite configurations in both places. You can always commit to either directory, and anytime you push or pull, the files will automatically be in the correct location, and you don't have to worry about copying files on disk. So this is my favorite super simple example of how to manage configuration. For me, this only works if you have one production environment, so not good for Pantheon, and one developer. So if you have more developers who need more dev actives, you're going to start getting out of sync, and it's going to be confusing. And so I'll show you a slightly more complicated configuration for multiple developers. But yeah, this is my favorite. I hope that makes sense. It's a little bit confusing. I can show you on my production site. Okay, this is kind of hard to see. Okay, so this is my production site. I have a configuration directory. I have the doc root. So if I go and look at the configuration directory, it looks exactly like my local environment. I have a dev active and live active, but in my configuration, my config directories, this is down here kind of at the bottom, I'll pull it up to the top. My active directory is now my live active, and my staging directory is now my dev active.
So you need to have so will this work on Pantheon, or this will not work on Pantheon?
No,
Okay.
it will not work on Pantheon.
Okay, I'll hold my questions until we move to the Pantheon thing, because most of our sites are hosted on Pantheon, and we'll just hold until you're there.
Okay, so my next example is one that works for slightly more complicated configurations. This is one that I like to use for multiple developers. And the example I'm going to use for this one is my generation website. So here, maybe I'll start with what the file system looks like. So here I have a doc root that has files, modules, core, all of that stuff, the same as before. But in my configuration directory, I have staging, which is version controlled, and it will be version controlled in all environments. I have a live active, which is version controlled in all environments. And then you can have any number of dev active versions of your site. So in some cases, I'll have one for me, I'll have one for another developer, I'll have, maybe, I don't know, whatever you want, you can set them up this way, because they're not going to be version controlled. And so that allows any developer to set it up however they want. So you're versioning your staging directory, which will always be the directory that's always staging in all environments. It'll be staging on local, it'll be staging on live, very different from the last setup where you had them backwards, right? One live, one staging in each place. This staging is staging everywhere. And then the live active directory, the only place this is used is on the live website. And so what I would do here is I would be able to log into the live server, commit anything in live active if there are any changes in live active. Some people like to not ever make changes to live active, and that's also fine. Most of my sites have changes happening to live active all the time, so I like to have that versioned. And then I can, wherever I'm working locally, I will manually copy files from live active to staging and commit them. And once those things are identical, I can start doing my work. And every developer who works on the platform will do the same thing. You always pull from live and make sure those directories are in sync before you start doing your work. And then when you do a deploy, what deploys is the staging directory. And then on the live site, you do a configuration sync to get those up to live. So what that looks like in terms of my configuration file is the staging directory. So staging on my development site, my live directory is dev active. On my live site, the active directory is live active. On anyone else's local environment, they could call it whatever they wanted. It doesn't matter. It's not in version control. Let's see. So in order to do a deploy in this environment, the way that there's two ways you can actually do a synchronize. One of them is through the interface, right? So we talked about this before. You can look at any potential changes that are showing up here, and you can hit the import button. There's also a command line utility. So this is something that like we use really commonly in Drupal. When you do a configuration, there's like a script that'll do a synchronize of your configuration changes when you get to production. You can do that with Backdrop too. You can do it with Drush. You can do it with B. If you want to do it on the command line, you can.
Yeah, do you have Drush Sim and those common?
I don't know. It's Drush Sim
Drush Sim, CIM. Configuration import? No.
Oh, the command. Yes.
Yeah.
It's bsim for backdrop configuration import in Drush with the backdrop extension. But yeah, we do have the same command. And if you're running, so that's confusing. If you're using the utility called B, it's bcim is the command. If you're running Drush, the command is Drush and then bcim. So 4 letters with the letter B to start. So I realized I said bsim, but like bsim is the same as Drush bsim. So yeah, 4 commands if you're running Drush with the letters in the command. The letter B and then the letter C, the letter I, and the letter M. Yes, that exists if you want to use it with Drush. I find that I use Drush on all, but I've started using B on all of my Backdrop sites. I find it preferable in most cases. What was I saying before that? So the way that I usually do deployment is I almost always will deploy the configuration using Git. So I'll live server, do a Git pull, and then I come to the user interface and I do the synchronization through the interface. And the main reason I do that is because I want to be able to see exactly what needs to be changed first. Like I'll see all of the files here and the list of what's changing. And then after I'll be able to review them, make sure that's all what I want. And then after the synchronize, I'll know if there were any issues, there are errors will show up on the screen, and I'll be able to go and adjust them. If you need to have a module installed or what have you, you're already in the environment where you can do that. You can do all of that on the command line if you prefer to. My workflow is to use the user interface. I don't know why. It seems to be my preference. So if you have a multi-developer setup where your staging directory is the only one that's in version control, any one of those people who are working on the site can do the same process. They can pull stuff down, work locally, commit it to staging, go up to the production and deploy it. And so you're not depending on one developer to be able to do something. This is how we manage all of the Backdrop CMS.org web properties. They're all set up in this way. This does assume we have one copy of the site running locally and one copy of the site on production. So this is different from Pantheon in that we don't have dev, test, and live environments on the production platform. We only have live. For Backdrop sites, we do have a beta version of every site, but it's usually a separate branch running the same two-site configuration. It's not the dev, test, live workflow where in Pantheon, when you do a deploy, you have to go from your local to your dev, to your test, to your live. We work in a slightly different pattern for Backdrop CMS.org where all of your code goes to beta, it gets approved, it gets merged in, and then it goes directly to live after that. Okay, so let's talk about how to do it on Pantheon. So let's see, I was choosing no recipe as my example, Backdrop. Okay, I don't know why there's a Backdrop Pantheon here also. That makes me a little nervous, but we're gonna go with this Backdrop because that's what I was working on earlier today. Okay, so configuration is a little bit different on Pantheon. For my local copy of the website, I still have a doc root or what would be a web directory if you're setting it up that way on Pantheon, and a configuration directory that is right next to it. For my local copy of the site, I have a staging directory outside of my web root and my dev active outside of my web root. This is just where I prefer to put my active environment for this should really be called local active, but this is where I prefer to run my local version of the files. Inside the doc root, in the files directory, so this is not versioned, we should have a config directory. Oh man, there's a lot of stuff in here. CO. There it is. And inside the config directory, I have 3 active directories. I have my dev active directory, so this is Pantheon dev. I have the test active directory, this is Pantheon test, and I have live active directory, and this is Pantheon live. And I keep all 3 of these separate so that any given time, all 3 of my websites can be in a different state. You can have stuff configured one way on dev, stuff configured another way on test, and stuff configured another way on live. And if you use the Pantheon interface to synchronize your sites across, like if you're copying files from live or copying files from test, you're not going to be interfering with a different state in either environment. So I usually like to keep them entirely separate like this. And then when I do deployment, all of my new configuration is going to be in that staging directory. That staging directory is version controlled, and it will deploy into the dev directory. Then I can do a config sync from staging to dev active. Then it'll go into the test directory, and I can do a config sync from from staging into test active. And then it goes to the live directory, and I do a config sync from staging to live active. So I like to have 3 designated places so that I can do that same process for each step of the deploy to make sure that it's going to work the same on dev and on test and on live when I get to the live configuration. So my configuration file for my settings file for what this looks like on Pantheon looks the same locally because again, I'm managing my configuration in the same way locally that I was for my other types of sites. That just sort of makes it easier for me. I don't have to worry about where the files are hosted when I'm managing my configuration the same way. In a perfect world, because Pantheon has a dev environment, I would call this local instead of dev. So we'll just see how crazy things go if I just change it. So I'll have a local active, and that way I don't get it confused with the dev active that's in files. And then on my production environment, it looks very different. So let's see if I have a copy. I don't know that I have one locally. Let me. Yes.
You define a location. So if you're in Pantheon, that's my understanding, and I wanted to double check whether that's correct. If we're changing file settings.pantheon PHP, and this is where we're saying where's active and where's staging configuration. Is that correct?
Yes. And you have to do it for each environment.
Okay.
So
There will be six lines, right?
I think it's more than that. Let me see if I have an example. Let me look in here.
Maybe it's in settings,
Local settings, Pantheon.
Yeah.
Show, geez, okay. I don't know what it's doing. Let's try it this way.
Andrea, you like this. I know whenever you see command line, you're happy.
Let's see what my Pantheon file looks like. No, it's not in there. Nope.
Yeah, I think
Okay, here's what it
Pantheon
is.
command line's a little bit confusing because I think of their terminus. I don't see that here, so I don't know.
Okay.
Yeah.
So this
I usually
this is how you put. I can see that you're putting it
Yes.
differently here. Okay, so this is different from. So I've been looking into this for a while, and it seems like everyone is doing slightly differently. Atom Group did it differently. But this makes sense because this clearly defines. So Active Directory is where. So which one is under Git? Active or staging?
staging.
Okay.
So this, I'm not sure this is, I'm not sure this is the most recent way of how I would do it, but what the thing that's really important in this particular example is this if Pantheon environment, define Pantheon environment. So while you're on Pantheon, these particular things are true. Like if the environment is dev, the active directory for files is inside the files directory, and it's called dev active. If you're on test, it's inside the files directory and it's called test active. If you're on live, you're inside the file directory and called live active. That is the only place that you can actively write files on the Pantheon platform is inside this files directory. So all of your active directories need to be inside files. For me, I would prefer to have my staging directory outside of my files directory because I want to deploy this, right? It's got to be version controlled. And so I would rather have it be parallel to the other files in my document root. So I would create a new directory called config and I have my staging there. If you're worried about that being something that people can read, you could add some kind of a, if you're on an Apache server, you could put an htaccess file in there and prevent people from seeing it. Another thing you could do is you could use like some random hash for the name of that config directory so people can't see it. If you have a Pantheon YAML file, you can mark any particular directory as being private. And so that's usually what I do. I can share a link to blog post on this later. But essentially what you do is in your Pantheon YAML file, you can define the config directory is private so no one can get there. And then in there you have your staging files that are version controlled. And then your files directory is just all the files that are not version controlled. And then the way that I have to manage my sites on Pantheon is that anytime before I start doing any changes, I do export from the UI from the live directory and make sure, or the active directory on the live environment, and I make sure that all of the files that are in that location are committed to my staging directory as a starting point. So that's like the baseline, is making sure that I'm not going to accidentally overwrite anything that's been changed in production, and we need to retain those changes. So this is the most complicated setup, mostly because there are multiple environments on the production server, but also because Pantheon requires those environments to be not version controlled in
Mhm.
order to be writable. Like those two things have to be the same on Pantheon. It has to, in order to be writable, it can't be version controlled, and it has to be in the files directory. On many other environments, you can have those two things be separate. Like you can have writable files that are version controlled, like all of our Backdrop CMS org servers are like that. My personal servers are like that. I have shared hosting servers that are like that, where there's no limitation on where your web server can write files. You can also have servers with various different configurations about where you can put those files. So like you can put them inside your doc root or outside your doc root. Sometimes on shared hosting, you don't have permission to write anything outside of your doc root. I find that in most instances, I want my configuration files to be outside of my doc root, so I'll try and look for an environment where I can do that. Pantheon is an example of one where you can have your staging outside your doc root, but all of your live has to be in files. So there's two complications for Pantheon. One is the 3 environments, and the other one is this limitation on where you can put writable files. Atten has a very different approach to how they're doing this, and they basically said, we don't need writable files. Everything they do is going to be changed only in version control. And so that means if they have to do any database updates, they're going to turn off their production site, do the database updates locally. If that contains a database update and a configuration update, they're going to commit the updated configuration file and deploy it. And so that way you're never writing those files on production. And so you can take the configuration out of the files directory. But if you want Backdrop to be able to run a database update on production and update your configuration, it has to be inside the files directory.
Okay, that is the key. I think this is the answer that it was very difficult. So I'm going to repeat it very slowly because I will forget it in approximately 16 minutes when I start my own talk. So I want to record it. So on Pantheon, if a site builder wants to make configuration changes
In production.
via web UI on
Yep.
any of the instances, the configuration, if we are making any adjustments to config, if we're trying to put define place for configuration files, it has to be inside the file structure.
Yes.
And that
That's-
is the key.
Yep.
If an organization makes decision that all the changes will be made directly in code, then it doesn't matter where configuration directory is stored.
True. Yep. That's exactly correct.
I think that was the biggest piece that I was missing by reading. So if I read your article and then I read an article, it's not exactly clear why things are happening slightly differently. And
Yep,
now
and
I think it's all in place. Thank you very much.
Yeah, I'm a little
I
bit
have-
looser with my configuration. I almost always want to be able to change stuff on production sites. I know that there are a lot of production workflows that where they do not like that. They want everything to be like QA'd and approved before it goes live. And that makes sense for those workflows. That's totally fine. I tend to configure stuff all the time on almost all of my production websites. And so I like to have the flexibility to do that.
So I had a question. I'm building a Backdrop site on Lando.
Yeah.
And you know, the initial configuration gives you a YAML file. Do you have any advice or experience with moving a Lando site to Pantheon? Or have you just not done that?
I don't use Lando, so I'm
Okay.
not exactly sure how the Lando local configuration maps to your Pantheon configuration, but I would imagine
it's-
it's fairly
what's-
similar to just doing it
Okay.
manually, where as long as your local configuration defines where your Active Directory is and your production environment defines where its active directories are, it should
Okay.
be fine because those things shouldn't be the same in both places. So you'll have a configuration file like this one where like in each environment it has a location of where the files are. Then anytime you do a deploy, it shouldn't interrupt that. What I think could be complicated if you're using Lando, and correct me if I'm wrong because I'm not super familiar with it, but I think it has the like button that'll allow you to downsync everything from Pantheon to your local.
Well, I
And in
haven't
that-
used that. I'm just from the command line, because what's nice about it, any sort of Lando is kind of like this Docker deploy system where you know, you have your YAML file that it sets up and then it creates everything from that. And so as long as your YAML file is correct, you don't have to kind of, you know, configure lots of other things because it's just kind of like reconstituted, you know?
Yeah.
And so, I'm just wondering, like, so if you move something to Pantheon, do you, export, you know, files and config and database separately? And is there some way to marry that on Pantheon? Have you like moved a site, let's say from Aten to Pantheon? And what did you have to do? Or,
Yeah, I
you know,
have moved a lot of sites onto Pantheon, and I always find the process more painful than necessary.
okay.
So it's not
just
just
me
you, it
then.
is hard. It doesn't, I don't think it
Okay.
has anything to do with Lando. I think it's just a little tricky because Pantheon is designed to like install for the first time on
Okay,
Pantheon.
that's
And so
okay, so
anytime you're trying to take something that already exists and move it, that's a little hard.
okay.
Usually what I do when I'm in that scenario is I do a Pantheon like install in place to get it up,
Mhm,
a new site up and running. And then I take my other site and I'll just
mhm,
take all the code and like overwrite the default code that Pantheon provides. And then on the dev environment, there's like an interface where you can like upload a database and upload your
mhm,
files. I try and do it that way. If the database or the files are too big, you can sometimes do it via Terminus and you can get all of the, or, you know, Drush aliases, and you can get
mhm,
everything in where you need to have it. And then once I have the development site working how I want it, then I'll deploy that upstream. And usually from then on, it's fine.
okay.
But I do, for some reason, it sounds straightforward when I say it like that. I always struggle with it. Usually the database won't upload, like their user interface times out, or like that, you know, Terminus throws strange error. There's always something I run into trying to move
Mhm,
on to Pantheon.
mhm.
But I feel like once you get it set up, the same process of upsyncing and downsyncing that works for Drupal should work for Backdrop.
And then I had like a Backdrop community question. So I'm running
Sure.
UberCart, and I keep getting like this annoying PHP error. So do I just reach out to the maintainers of that module, or what do you suggest?
Yeah, if you're sure the error is coming from UberCart, then the best thing to do would be to go to the issue queue for UberCart and see if anyone else is having that error. It's pretty
Okay.
likely someone else is. And if that's the case, there might already be a fix for you there, even if it's not in, you know, the latest release of the
Okay.
module. If it's not, just put the whole error in there and, you know, explain this scenario under which it comes up. And I'm sure there's other people using the module who will
Okay.
help sort it out. Yeah, same thing is true for any contrib project. If you can identify, this is definitely coming from this module, this is coming from menu position, this is coming from whatever it is, I would definitely recommend going to the issue queue and reporting the whole error there. If you don't know where it's coming from, that's a little harder. Sometimes you get an error that like doesn't tell you exactly what, you know, it'll show some file in core, but the problem is in contrib module. And in that case, sometimes you need some help walking through steps like how to identify where the error is. And in those cases, I would say you should ask in the forum, because there's a bunch of other people who have already been through that process and know how to help you track down the source of the problem. Sometimes the problem does come from Backdrop core. And if that's the case, the issue would go into the core queue, and hopefully we'll get that solved in a future release as well.
Well, thank you so much. Does anyone have any other questions for Jen? I feel like that was a lot of information and our brains are full.
It was a lot of overly technical explanations. Yeah.
Yes.
Thank
But
you.
that was
This
really
is
great.
terrific. And we're gonna have a follow-up session, hopefully in person, to set up the settings on Pantheon. So our lovely webcam site that is running Backdrop CMS on the front and Decanter Stanford theme on the front, which makes it best of both worlds. We'll have also configuration in version control, just for the best practices. So thank you very much, Jen.
All right.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Yeah, thank you.